विद्वानेवं विभावये समथेन विपश्यना सुयुक्तः गुरुते क्लेश.
Hi, this is Professor Bryan van Norden, and this is part one of Introducing Buddhist Philosophy. So what we were listening to is a recitation of a great classic of Indian Buddhist philosophy, the Bodhikaryavattara by Shantideva. And what we're looking at is a sculpture, Guanyin of the Southern Sea, which is a Chinese Buddhist work reflecting the fact that although Buddhism started in India, it moved out to other parts of the world, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's start to look at when Buddhism originated and then what happened after that. So as this chart shows, Buddhism moved out throughout Asia, but Buddhism was founded in South Asia by a historical individual, Siddhartha Gautama, who was probably born in the 6th century BCE, although there is some dispute about his dates. He's also known by the name Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya tribe. And Buddha is a title meaning enlightened one. And so the historical Buddha can be called the Buddha, but other people who are considered enlightened can be called the Buddha. And supposedly there were multiple incarnations of the Buddha. So you can use the title Buddha to refer to these earlier incarnations as well. Now, Buddhism, although it started in India and became very influential, it eventually almost died out in India, but Buddhist missionaries went north and east into Tibet, Mongolia, China, and then eventually the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and also Vietnam. And those Buddhists carried what became Mahayana Buddhism into Eastern Asia. And then other Buddhist missionaries went south and east and carried what became Theravadan Buddhism into Sri Lanka and most of Southeast Asia. Now, as this chart suggests, there are some people who further subdivide Buddhism into a third kind, into Vajrayana. Personally, I think you can treat Vajrayana as just a form of Mahayana Buddhism, although there's some dispute about that. And in this lecture and the next one, I'm going to be focusing particularly, although not exclusively, on Theravadan Buddhism. Now, Buddhism came to China sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era. And in ancient China, in the Zhou dynasty, which was a formative intellectual period in Chinese thought from around 1045 to 221 BCE, there were a lot of different philosophical schools. Some people talk about the 100 schools of thought in ancient China. But only 2 of the indigenous traditions of Chinese philosophy survived into later Chinese history, Confucianism and Taoism. And then Buddhism came to China during what's called the Han Dynasty in the 1st century, but it didn't really catch on until the following centuries in the 6 dynasties period. But then eventually it became, along with Taoism and Confucianism, one of the 3 teachings, the Sanjiao, of traditional Chinese thought. And those also became the 3 teachings of Korea, Japan, and, as I say, Vietnam. Now, what are the key doctrines of Buddhism, particularly in its earliest Indian formulation? One of the key teachings of Buddhism is the 4 Noble Truths. Now, what I'm going to give you here is 2 ways of understanding the 4 Noble Truths. There's a way of understanding the 4 Noble Truths that is intuitive and that captures the way many practicing Buddhists understand their own religion, including many Buddhist monks and nuns. But then I'm going to raise some philosophical objections to this understanding of the 4 Noble Truths, and I'm going to give you an alternative understanding of the 4 Noble Truths. And this other way of interpreting it is the way many Buddhist philosophers and philosophically sophisticated Buddhists in the tradition understand the 4 Noble Truths. But first, a kind of quick intuitive way of understanding the 4 Noble Truths. So the first Noble Truth is that life is suffering. How so? Well, for example, suppose you want a fancy sports car, an expensive fancy sports car. When you don't have the sports car, you suffer because you want the car and you don't have it. But then even after you get it, you might think you're going to be happy. But everybody who's bought a new car knows when you first get the car, it's got that new car smell and everything's all clean and there's not a scratch on it. As soon as you drive it off of the lot, it starts to get scratches, it starts to wear down. Before you know it, you spilled coffee all over your nice inside of the car and your friends tracked mud in and a bunch of scratches are marring the paint and he doesn't have the new car smell anymore. So life's just suffering. You suffer because you don't have things you want, but then when you get them, they end up not being as good as you thought they were going to be. And very soon, whatever new thing you liked about it gets old. So the first noble truth is that life is suffering. The second one is that the cause of this suffering is desire. So I suffer because I want the sports car I don't own. And then after I get it, I still suffer because my desire either isn't fully satisfied or I end up wanting something else or the object of my desire changes so it no longer satisfies my desire. Well, if life is suffering and the cause of suffering is desire, the third noble truth is that the way to end our suffering is to cease desiring. And if you manage to cease desiring during your lifetime, then after you die, or at the point at which you die, you'll achieve this state of bliss called nirvana, which is so blissful, it just transcends all the highest pleasures we can imagine in a life dominated by ordinary desires. How do you cease desiring and achieve nirvana? The way to cease desiring is to follow the Eightfold Path. My dog, you're hearing in the background, has not learned to follow the Eightfold Path, so he's going to bark while I'm lecturing. Well, there's something attractive about this, and if you are a believer in Buddhism, if you're a Buddhist, I'm not telling you how to understand your own tradition. There are many Buddhists who understand the Four Noble Truths this way, but among Buddhist philosophers, they'll give a slightly more nuanced account. Let's take the first truth, that life is suffering. Well, there's a lot of suffering in life, but it seems like for at least many of us, there's also a lot of pleasure in life. It seems like saying that life is just suffering is not nuanced enough. So for example, here is a cup of coffee. And for me, when I get up in the morning and I want a cup of coffee and I sip that coffee, that first sip of coffee in the morning is one of the high points of my day. And it's a great pleasure. And admittedly, it's a transient pleasure, but it still seems pleasurable. And it doesn't really seem like it ends with awful suffering. So maybe a deeper way of understanding the first noble truth is not that life is nothing but suffering, but that life for most people is categorized by an unsatisfactory impermanence. And in Sanskrit, there's a technical name for this unsatisfactory impermanence, dukkha. Right? So for many people, life has a kind of unsatisfactory impermanence. And the cause of this unsatisfactory impermanence, what is it? Well, we could say it's desire, but desire can take many forms. So for example, what if I desire to become enlightened, or I desire to help other people? The term desire in a way is either too vague or it's too specific. If desire is very specific, then we have some motivations that are not desires. If you mean desire to refer to whatever motivates us, then it's vague. It could refer to anything, including some motivations that might be good. So a more philosophically precise way of formulating the second noble truth might be the cause of unsatisfactory impermanence is the craving for permanence, which can never be satisfied. And there's a technical term for that, which is tanha. So how does that appeal to the coffee example? Well, so I get up in the morning and I have a desire, in a sense, to have that first cup of coffee in the morning. And I have that sip. That's good coffee. Well, that's not unrelieved suffering. And my desire for the coffee and the pleasure I get from it doesn't seem problematic. What is problematic, though, and this is an issue I face, is that I have that first cup of coffee in the morning, and it's so good that I don't want to just stop at that first cup of coffee. And I end up having a second one and a third one and a fourth one. Why? Because I'm trying to recapture that great feeling of the first cup of coffee in the morning. And there's a part of me that just thinks, well, the first cup of coffee was so good, the second one's going to be just as good. And if it's not, well, then I'll try a third one. And if that's not good, I'll try a fourth one. And I'm trying to recapture that first cup of coffee in the morning feeling, but you can't do that. You can only do that once a day. So what's problematic, it's not that all of life is suffering. What's problematic is that for many people, including often me, life has an unsatisfactory impermanence about it because I have this craving for permanence that can't be satisfied. And so I'm not satisfied with one cup of coffee in the morning. I'm not satisfied sometimes with one dessert, right? So after dinner, I have a piece of cheesecake and I'm like, well, that was really good. So I'll have more. But the second piece of cheesecake isn't as good. I feel bloated and I feel like I've had too much. And so a lot of life is characterized by this craving to have the same experience over and over again when you can't, because life is characterized by change. So the problem for many people, it's not that everything's unrelieved suffering, it's that we're trying to cling to permanence that is impossible to achieve in a changing world. That doesn't mean we can't genuinely enjoy, though, the transient pleasures that we encounter, as long as we recognize that they're transient. So how do you end suffering? It's not going to be by ending all desire, or it's not going to be by ending all motivations, because then you just sit around and do nothing. And contrary to some stereotypes, that's not what Buddhists do. The way to end suffering is to cease craving for impermanence is to end the unsatisfactory impermanence. And that's what nirvana is. So in other words, it's not that you first cease desiring and then suffering ends, and then at the end of your life, you achieve the bliss of nirvana. It's that what brings to an end the unsatisfactory impermanence of the world is letting go of the craving for permanence, which is unsatisfiable. And letting go of that unsatisfiable craving for permanence, that's what nirvana is. There's nothing to nirvana beyond letting go of the craving to keep things the way they are. So there's a Taylor Swift song where she sings about, she says about being 22 years old and how fun it is to be 22 years old. I remember being 22, and a lot of the things she sings about in that song I can relate to. So Buddhism is not saying you shouldn't enjoy being 22 years old, but it is saying that when you're 58 like me, it's okay to look back with pleasure on being 22. What's not okay is to think I'm going to be 22 forever. Now I'm 58, I should enjoy the pleasures of being 58 and not be stuck on trying to enjoy the pleasures of being 22. Those are different stages of my life. But I can enjoy each of those stages as long as I let go of the craving to stay in any one state permanently. And then how do we let go of the craving for permanence? Well, still, it's going to be the Eightfold Path. So it is the Eightfold Path. Now, when I first heard about the Eightfold Path and I saw the list, the 8 items, I said, boy, that just seems like a kind of unsystematic hodgepodge of a bunch of different things. But then I learned that the Eightfold Path can actually be subdivided into different headings. So on the Eightfold Path, there are some parts of the path that are about ethical conduct. There are some parts of the path that are about mental discipline. And there are a couple parts of the path that are about wisdom. Now, the things under ethical conduct, they're things that will be familiar to people from other religious and spiritual traditions. And what I find is when people study other philosophical traditions, they tend to either overemphasize the differences between different traditions, or they underemphasize the differences and they assimilate very different traditions. But in this case, under ethical conduct, many of the things the Eightfold Path recommends are going to sound intuitive and familiar to people of other spiritual traditions. For example, ethical conduct includes right speech. What does that mean? Don't lie, don't be impolite or insulting, don't gossip. Right action, don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat other people, don't commit adultery. Right livelihood, right? So don't take a job that intrinsically involves hurting other people. Try not to deal in weapons or poisons or intoxicants. So these are specific recommendations about conduct, but there are also general habits of mind that you want to emphasize and try to cultivate. So right effort, that is to say, make a commitment to prevent or get rid of evil states of mind like selfishness and cruelty and anger, and instead try to develop good states of mind. Well, if you're going to try to develop good states of mind and get rid of bad states of mind, and if you're going to try to have good conduct, you've got to become mindful of your thoughts and mindful of your actions. You have to be aware, am I lying or stealing, or have I picked a career that involves hurting other people? Am I dwelling on negative thoughts? Or am I making an effort to have positive thoughts? And that involves a kind of self-monitoring or mindfulness. And right concentration, which means meditation. And there's a lot to be said about meditation in the Buddhist tradition. I'll try to have another lecture about that because it's a really interesting topic, the various ways in which you can meditate. Now, wisdom is about particular substantive attitudes or beliefs, and it includes right understanding, which is understanding the truths of Buddhism, especially the Four Noble Truths, but then also having the right motivation or goals. That is to say, thinking selfless and compassionate thoughts. So when you understand how it works systematically, the Eightfold Path actually, makes a lot of logical sense. It's got specific recommendations about how to live, recommendations about what kind of mental states to cultivate, and what kind of goals in terms of your understanding and your motives you want to achieve. Now, we said in looking at the Four Noble Truths that the real cause of the major form of human suffering, this kind of dukkha, this unsatisfactory impermanence of the world, is our craving for permanence, our craving that we permanently possess particular things in the world. We possess them forever. Why is that so problematic? Because of the truth of an-atman. And an-atman, atman means self, and an is a privative prefix, and so an-atman just means no self. So one of the key philosophical teachings about Buddhism is that we don't have a self, and so the craving for you to permanently possess other things is confused because you've got an illusion that you've got a self, and the things you're pursuing have selves, and you're trying to permanently possess those things. Now, this is, to me, one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of Buddhism, but to appreciate what's at stake, it's helpful to draw some contrasts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to quickly sketch several different views you could have in metaphysics. Metaphysics is a term that different philosophers use in different ways. But one way you could use the term metaphysics is you could say, metaphysics asks the question, what are the most fundamental kinds of things that exist, and how are those things related to one another? And you have opinions about metaphysics, whether you know it or not. So for example, here's a stock photo of 7 people in a line, or as they say in the Commonwealth countries, 7 people in a queue. Well, let's just ask a seemingly innocent question. How many things are there in the world in this situation with 7 people in line? What's your answer? Here are some possible answers. Maybe you say, well, there's 7 people in line, there's 7 things there. Perhaps surprisingly, some people would say, no, there's 8 things here. Some people would say that there's approximately 49 times 10 to the 27th power things in the world in this situation. And yet other philosophers would say, looks like 7 things. There's really just one thing. So before we go any further, take a second and ask yourself, which of these is your answer? You think there's 7 things in this situation, 8, approximately 49 times 10 to the 27th power things, or is there 1? Smart philosophers give each of these answers. Let's see why. Why might you say there are 7 things in the world in this situation? Well, geez, because it's common sense. There's 7 people in line, so there's 7 things in this situation. You might think that the world consists of the objects we experience every day and their properties. So for example, this is one thing, it's a coffee mug. I can sip the coffee that is in the coffee mug. And that's what the world is, things that have properties or qualities. What philosophers look at the world that way? Well, in the South Asian tradition, in India, the Nyāya school of philosophy, going back to the Nyāya Sutra and the commentaries on it, holds this view. They'd say there's 7 things here, 7 objects which each have their own properties. Aristotelians, Aristotle and his followers would also say 7 things here. And then there's the properties of each of the things. One person might be wearing a red top, another person might be wearing a blue top, but they're separate individuals, each with their own qualities. It's a very commonsensical view, and that's one of the reasons people are attracted to views like the Aristotelian view or the Nyāya philosophy view. Some people would say there are 8 things in this situation. How come? Well, it's true there are 7 people, but you forgot to count one more thing, the line that the people are in. In order for the sentence, there are 7 people in line, to be true, there have to be 7 people, but there also has to be the line. Because after all, you could have 7 people who are not in a line. You could have 7 people who are just milling around. The fact that it's true that there are 7 people in line means there's an aspect of reality, the line, that contributes to the truth of the situation. One of the philosophers who would give this answer is W.V.O. Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, a famous American philosopher of the 20th century. And Quine argued that in order for sentences in mathematics, like 1 + 1 = 2, and sentences in biology, like whales are mammals, to be true, there must exist sets in addition to objects. Because a sentence like 1 + 1 = 2 isn't just about one object putting another object in the pile and having 2 objects, because you're not just talking about those objects, whether they're stones or pennies. You're saying in general, any case of 1 and 1 is 2. And when you say whales are mammals, you're not saying something just about contemporary whales and contemporary mammals. You're saying something about any whale there ever was or could be, and any mammal there is or could be. So you're talking at some level about sets. So sets have to be part of the world in addition to the individuals that go into them. Why might you think there are 49 times 10 to the 27th power things in this situation? Well, what if you thought that a person or an organization or a nation, or if you want a chariot or an automobile, only exists by verbal convention? Well, if these things only exist by verbal convention, what is real? Well, what if you said what is real are the temporary, transient configurations of matter and mental states that we label as Professor Van Norden, or President Biden, or Pope Francis, and President Obama, or Vassar College, or New York? Does New York or Vassar College exist as a thing in the universe? Or do we just have verbal conventions about how we talk about the configurations of matter, and in the case of people, the mental states that are out there in the world, and we label them in certain ways? Now, how did I get this number? Well, an average person, I looked this up, has apparently 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms in their body. 7 people in line, 7 times 7 is 49. So that's how I got approximately 49 times 10 to the 27th power things in the world in this situation. Who would say this? Who would say that that's how many things are there in this situation? Well, classic atomists might say something like this. So materialist philosophers who believe that the only thing that exists are atoms in the void, might say something like this. So there were ancient Greek atomists like Democritus, and then Lucretius in the Roman world. And then atomic theory got picked up in modern chemistry by people like Dalton. So if you're an atomist, you might say, well, what really exists are just the atoms, and we have conventions for how we label those atoms, but the people or the objects are not additional things on top of that. You know who else would say this? Nāgasena, a Theravadan Buddhist philosopher, in a classic philosophical dialogue, The Questions of King Milinda. And we'll look more at his argument in just a moment. Well, what kind of person would say there's just one thing in this situation? Admittedly, it looks like there's 7 things, but some philosophers would say appearances are deceiving. There's really only one reality, although it appears to be a plurality. So one reason you might think this is you might think that everything that exists is defined by its relationship to other things. Let's look at a concrete example. So I'm Bryan Van Norden. What am I? If you try to explain what I am, what's a good answer? Well, I'm a son. I'm also a brother. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a teacher. I'm an American. But notice each of those descriptions, those qualities I have that's partially definitive of who I am, is relational. I'm a son because I have a mother and father. I'm a brother because I have brothers and a sister. I'm a husband and a father because of my nuclear family. I'm a teacher because I'm employed by a college. I'm an American because I'm related to a government and other individuals. Even if you say I'm a mammal, the reason mammals exist as a type of creature is that there are animals of a particular kind that evolved. And it's by standing in a relationship to those things that I am a mammal. Now, you might be tempted to say, yeah, but at an atomic level or the level of physics, you're not a relational being, aren't I? As a physical object, I'm composed of molecules. Those molecules are composed of atoms. Those atoms are composed of subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are composed of mass energy standing in space-time relations. All mass energy in the universe was connected at the time of the Big Bang and continues to have quantum entanglements as a result of that. Furthermore, everything that has mass has its own gravitational field, which interacts with the gravitational field of other objects. And the nature and qualities of the particles that make up my physical body is determined by their former causal relationships and current causal relationships. So even if you want to describe me as a physical object, you can't explain the properties I have. You don't have a complete explanation until you know how I came into existence, and that's going to be a set of relational properties. So some philosophers will say, well, as a result, there's no individual things that exist. Everything that exists is in a relationship with everything else. So really, there's only one thing that exists, the sum total of everything that's related to everything else in the universe. Who would say this? Interestingly, a Chinese Buddhist philosopher, Fazang, in the Huayan Buddhist tradition, said this in the Tang Dynasty in China. And Fazang is a kind of Mahayana Buddhist, and he's very influenced by earlier Indian Buddhists like Nagarjuna and Shantideva, although I think they would shy away with the monism. This monism is the metaphysical view that ultimately only one thing exists. I think some Indian Buddhists would shy away from Fazang's monism, but Fazang is led to a monistic metaphysics by this relational view. He wouldn't deny that in some sense there's 7 people, but in a deeper sense, the identity of each of the people depends on their relationships to other people and other objects in the universe. Other monist philosophers include the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, and the classic Indian commentators on the Gita like Shankara and Ramanuja. But the Gita gives a very different argument for metaphysical monism. And interestingly, the argument that the Gita gives is very similar to an argument apparently given independently by Parmenides, an ancient Greek philosopher. So the Gita and Parmenides agree with Fazang that only one thing exists, but their argument for why only one thing exists is similar to each other. The Gita and Parmenides are similar, but it's very different in form from the argument Fazang gives. If you're interested, you can look up what the metaphysical views of the Gita and Parmenides are. But that's why you might think that. Now, if you're like me, I'm a philosophy professor, and so you might think, oh, I bet Van Norden was always really interested in philosophy. I bet he always found this stuff fascinating. Honestly, when I was a student, I was the kid who was always like, what difference does this make? Why do we need to know this? But fortunately, I had good philosophy teachers who said, I'll tell you what difference this makes. I'll tell you why this is important. So let's consider these metaphysical views we just saw. What difference does it make if there are 7 distinct persons here? Well, if there are 7 distinct people, we might ask, why should any one of them care about the well-being of the others? There are different answers you could give. One answer is given by Aristotle. Aristotle said that God, or the natural order anyway, created humans with a purpose, a telos. In Greek, that means an end, a goal. And the end or goal, the telos of human beings, is to live in a community. And this is what Aristotle means with this famous line from his classic work, The Politics. It's usually quoted as man is by nature a political animal, but the original classical Greek actually says humans, not man. And what Aristotle means by the word that gets rendered political is more like what we would mean by social or communal. So what Aristotle really says is humans are by nature social animals. In other words, we're built to live in a community. So Aristotle does think there are 7 distinct individuals here, but he'd say those 7 distinct individuals were created by nature to live in a community together. It's part of their telos or goal built into them at their creation. And so that's why you should care about the well-being of other people. Now, at the beginning of the modern era, people like Thomas Hobbes, who's a 17th century philosopher, Hobbes rejected the Aristotelian view, and he said talk of ends or purposes or goals in nature is nonsense. Ends are things that humans have, that they create with their desires and that with their projects, but the natural world doesn't have ends or goals built into it. However, Hobbes said, it is in each individual human's self-interest to form a society for the benefit of all. Why? Well, in his work, The Leviathan, Hobbes famously says that life without government is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because in life without any government control, without any centralized power, humans will end up fighting each other, each pursuing their own self-interest, and it'll be worse than even the most despotic government. So you're just better off having a government. If you think of any post-apocalyptic movie or TV series, like I really enjoyed, The Walking Dead, or you think of like any of the Mad Max movies, either the original ones or the reboot, those post-apocalyptic views of the dystopia when society breaks down, that's what Hobbes has in mind. And he says that's where we're going to go if we don't have any government. So although we are genuinely distinct individuals, Hobbes says, and although Hobbes says there are no ends or goals given to us by God or by the natural world, it is in our individual self-interest to contract together, to work together, to get out of the state of nature in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, what difference does it make if Hobbes and Aristotle are wrong and there are no individual persons, but are instead 49 times 10 to the 27th power transient physical and mental states. What implications does that have for how we should live? Well, what the Buddhists are going to say, and what Buddhists like Nāgasena in the Theravadan tradition are going to say, is if there are no selves, there's no reason to compete with others, no reason to steal from others, no reason to fight with others, no reason to hate others. To try to take wealth, power, and prestige from others to have it for yourself is a mistake based on a triple illusion. You don't have a permanent self that could possess anything. The things you're trying to possess are not real. And the people you're competing against, the people you're hurting and killing and stealing from and cheating, are not real either. They couldn't possess anything to take away from you. And the things you're fighting over, like wealth, power, and prestige, exist only by verbal convention. It's only by convention that a dollar bill has any significance. It's only by convention that the numbers that come up when I check my bank account have any significance. And yeah, we act like they have a significance, but if you organize your life around collecting those pieces of paper or getting social prestige, you're organizing your life around something that really doesn't have any independent existence. And this is the answer that Theravadan Buddhist philosophers like Nāgasena give in the Questions of King Milinda. That's the payoff, the difference it makes if this ends up being true. Well, what about if there's only one thing that exists? What if monism, metaphysical monism, is true and there's only one thing that exists? Why then should you care about the well-being of other people? Well, you should care for other people because they are you. Caring for other people is simple self-interest. And this is put really memorably in a famous line from the Upanishads, which are classic Indian philosophical work. It says, "That art thou." That art thou. What does that mean? It means if you look at that coffee mug, you're inclined to think it's a separate thing from you, but that art thou. At some metaphysical level, this thing is you. And that's why I shouldn't be casually destructive even of inanimate objects. That's why I should care about other humans, because in a way they are me. They're a part of what I am. Now, in the Chinese tradition, you get a movement called, in English, we call it Neo-Confucianism. It develops in the Sung and later dynasties, and it's a Confucian reaction against Buddhism. But Neo-Confucianism, although it's a Confucian reaction against Buddhism, is very influenced by ideas it got from Buddhism. And so you find one later Neo-Confucian philosopher, Wang Yangming, giving a justification for benevolence or concern for others that's based on a broadly monistic metaphysics. Wang says, great people regard heaven, earth, and the myriad creatures as their own bodies. They look upon the world as one family and China as one person within it. Those who, because of the space between their own physical form and those of others, regard themselves as separate from heaven, earth, and the myriad creatures, are petty persons. So although there is a physical space between us, Wang is saying if that's your only reason for thinking you're really separate from other people, that's shallow. Because at a deeper level, you're connected to other people. Other Americans make me who I am as an American. My ancestors help make me who I am. My descendants help make me who I am. My students help make me who I am. So that's why I should care about them. So this seemingly abstract metaphysical issue, how many things are really there, can have some very important ethical payoffs. But I want to focus on one Buddhist answer, the one given by Nāgasena in this work, The Questions of King Milinda. Why does he think that this is true, that there are approximately 49 times 10 to the 27th power things in this situation? And he wouldn't limit it just to atoms. He'd also say that mental states of various kinds are there. Well, according to early Theravadan Buddhism, their metaphysics says that there are 5 skandha, and skandha might be rendered as aggregates or heaps. And the idea is that there are 5 kinds of things that exist. And all that exists are instances of these 5 kinds of things. The first kind is material form. So there are instances of physical objects, matter, and the objects of the senses. But then there are feelings, which are mental states, particularly sensations and other experiences that might be positive, negative, or neutral. That was a negative experience of having a dry throat. There's also perceptions, which is conceptual recognition or cognition of a thing, and mental formations, which are all the different motivations we have, including desires, intentions, choices. Then there's consciousness. Sorry, I didn't mean to set that off. Then there's consciousness. And different interpreters understand consciousness in different ways, but one way you might understand it is if I have an itch on my foot, the itch is a mildly negative feeling. If I become aware or conscious of the fact that there's an itch on my foot, that's consciousness. So awareness of other states is consciousness. This is a little abstract, so let's look at this, a more concrete example, chocolate chip cookies. So I'll meet myself over here for a second. So the cookies themselves, the physical cookies, are material form, right? So they're, in our terms, they're molecules and atoms of a certain kind. That's their material form. And Nāgasena would say, yep, that's one of the things that exists in reality is these particular atoms at an instant in time. Then there's feelings we might have about the cookies, and that might include the sensation of smelling the baked dough, the chocolate, and just a hint of vanilla extract, right? And that's a positive feeling. Now, since I've experienced chocolate chip cookies before, I now have a perception, a recognition that what I'm smelling is chocolate chip cookies, which is different from the raw feeling. And this leads to a mental formation, specifically a desire to eat the cookies. Now, when I've got the feeling and the perception and now the desire to eat the cookies, I become aware of these mental states. And now I might reflect upon whether I should eat all the cookies right now or eat just a couple and save some for later. And I might reflect on the fact that, well, if I eat all the cookies now, I'm going to be really stuffed and I'm going to feel kind of like a sugar rush. It'll be unpleasant. So I'll just have a couple cookies now and save the rest for later. Now, if you're me, I'm still going to eat all the cookies, but at least I did have the consciousness to know that that's a bad idea, even though I'm about to do it. So there's a concrete example of how we have instances of the 5 skandhas. So what Nāgasena is saying is all that exists in the universe are instances of various physical and mental states. There's not selves as we understand them. Well, why should you think there isn't a self in addition to the physical and mental states? And here Nāgasena uses a very famous philosophical argument, the simile of the chariot. So in Questions of King Milinda, the monk Nāgasena goes to see King Milinda, and he says, the king says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm called Nāgasena, but that's just a name. There's no person as such to be found." And the king teases him and says, "Oh, really? There's no person there. So who is it that I've been giving these donations to? And if someone murdered you, I guess it wouldn't be a crime because there's no person, Nāgasena." And in response, Nāgasena says, "Your Majesty, I assume you came here to our meeting in a chariot, right?" And the king says, "Yes, I did." And he says, "Let's talk about what the chariot is." So here's a diagram of the parts of the chariot. And Nāgasena starts out by saying, well, what is the chariot? Is the pole of the chariot the chariot? No, it's not, because you could have the pole of a chariot without having the chariot. I've got a Prius, and likewise, is the Prius the front? Is the Prius the drive shaft? No. Is the Prius the tire? No, because you could have a tire without the Prius, and you could also just have a Prius without the tire, but you'd still think you had the Prius. And you can do that for every part of the chariot or every part of the car. The thing is not identical with any part of it. Well, then you might be tempted to say, but then, sire, is the chariot the pole, the axle, the wheels, the body, the flagstaff, the yoke, the reins, and the goad taken together? Likewise, you might be tempted to say, well, Van Norden, your Prius is the wheels and the wiper blades and the carburetor and the engine block and so on and so forth, all those parts taken together. That actually won't work as an answer. Why? Because if the chariot were all these parts taken together, then if a single part was taken away, the chariot would be gone. And that's not how we talk, right? So my Toyota Prius doesn't go away just because I replace one or even all four tires. I got 100,000 miles on my Prius, more than 100,000 miles. I've replaced the tires a couple times. It's still the same thing. So that collection of parts, that particular collection of parts, can't be what the self or the identity of the Prius is. Well, then, is the chariot something different from its parts? Well, that seems weird. No, the chariot can't be something different from the parts. My Toyota Prius is not a thing separate from its parts. Well, then the tentative conclusion that Nāgasena arrives at, I guess, Your Majesty, you lied to me when you said you came here on a chariot, because you can't point out a thing that is the chariot. Now, why is that supposed to be so philosophically important? Well, because you can run the same argument about a person like Nāgasena or me or you. So, for example, is it, revered sir, that the hairs of the head are Nāgasena? So are my hairs me? No, because just because you had a lock in my hair, you wouldn't have me, and my hair's falling out all the time, a lot more than I'd like. But I don't think that's made me disappear. Nāgasena goes on, is the person the fingernails or the blood or the saliva or the liver? No, there's no part of you that's the same as you. Now, again, you might be tempted to say, aha, but then, revered sir, is Nāgasena material shape and feeling and perception and habitual tendencies and consciousness? In other words, am I or are you the sum total of our physical and mental states at an instant in time? Clearly not, for the same reason that my Prius isn't identical with its current parts. Because if I'm identical with my current physical and mental states, I'm gone. Because from second to second, we know that matter is in constant motion. Atoms are just churning and changing at the subatomic level. Every time I breathe in and breathe out, my body is changing. And my mental states, every time I blink or my eyes look to the left or right, my mental states are changing. So if I'm identical with this particular set of mental and physical states, then I'm gone in a second. And that's not what we think a self is. Well then, revered sir, is there Nāgasena apart from the material shape, feelings, perception, and habitual tendencies and consciousness? We'll return to this, but at least as a first approximation, it seems like, well, no, that'd be weird. How could I be a thing separate from each of these states? Therefore, I guess there's no Nāgasena. But then Nāgasena qualifies it and he says, well, really, the best thing to say is not simply that there's no chariot or no Nāgasena. Instead, what we should say is, just as when the parts are rightly set, the word chariot is spoken. So when there are the aggregates, instances of the five skandha, the five aggregates, it is the convention to say a being. Now, at first glance, this might seem like the second answer, the one that we rejected. Like, well, aren't you saying that the chariot is these parts? Or Van Norden is this collection of physical and mental states? No, that's not what Nāgasena is saying. He's saying There is no thing in the world that is Van Norden or Nāgasena or Melinda or you or the Prius. But we have social conventions about how we use expressions like Van Norden's Prius or Bryan Van Norden or the monk Nāgasena or whatever your name is. We have social verbal conventions about how we use names, but those names don't pick out one self in the world. We just have conventions about how we use them in the presence of various experiences. And in ordinary circumstances, we know how those conventions work and how to use them. But that doesn't mean they pick out a particular persistent, unchanging thing in the world, because they don't. We couldn't find a thing like that in the world. So the general structure of this argument, we might analyze it like this. For anything, whether it's a person or an object or a cat or a flower, we might say, what is the self, the being, or the identity of X, where X is an automobile or a person or a cat or a dog or any object. And then we only have a few different options that we can plump for. Is X identical with one of its parts? Or is X identical with all of its parts taken together? Or is X identical with something other than its parts? Seems like each answer is unsatisfactory. No, X is not identical with one of its parts, because you don't have an X just because you have one of its parts. And certainly some parts of X can be lost, like the wheels on a car, and you don't feel like you lost the car, even if it's really inconvenient that you've lost the wheel. So is X identical with all of its parts together? No, because if X were identical with all these parts together this way, then even the most insignificant change in the parts would mean X ceases to exist. And for most X's, we don't say that. We don't say the car's gone just because you lost a wheel. Is X identical with something other than its parts? That seems crazy too, because how could X be something distinct from all of its parts? Our tentative conclusion is that, well, I guess there's no X, but then maybe a better way of phrasing it is, well, we have a social convention that we say X when certain parts are present, but that X doesn't refer to a self, a being, or a persistent independent thing. It's just a convention we have about how we use the words. Well, this is the end of part one. I'm going to put up a link to part two of the lecture. And one of the things we're going to look at in part two of the lecture, after we review some of these arguments, is we're going to look at a suggestion for something that might be yourself that is different from any of the parts of yourself, particularly your soul. Because you've probably been thinking, well, maybe I accept these arguments for the automobile, but I don't accept these arguments for a person like me, because the person like me has a soul, whereas the automobile doesn't. And that soul is my identity. But Nāgasena anticipates this argument, and even whether you accept his argument or not, it raises some really interesting questions that thinkers in the Western traditions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have also wrestled with about the nature of the soul. So next time we'll talk about the soul and whether or not your soul is your genuine identity. See you next time.